Hey everyone, tonight we start with a man who acted like the laws of physics were just polite suggestions, and sleep was something he could choose not to do. Leonardo da Vinci. So, before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. You could turn on a fan for that soft buzz in the background. And let's take it easy as we go on this journey together. Before we admire the brilliant inventions of Leonardo da Vinci, we need to know who or what we're talking about. Leonardo was not an ordinary person. People who are normal sleep, forget things, and sometimes stare at walls. Leonardo did all three at once, and then came up with a better way to look at walls. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the small Tuscan town of Vinci. He was born out of wedlock. Child, which in the Renaissance meant you didn't get any property, but you did get trauma. Fortunately, he made up for it by developing a brain that worked like it was plugged directly into the universe's debug mode. Leonardo was drawing swirling water currents and taking apart mechanical toys to see how the gears felt about their life choices while other kids were playing with sticks. He was probably already measuring bird wings and asking questions that made people uncomfortable, like why, by the time he was 10. Why doesn't the human shoulder move like this? In the Renaissance, parents didn't have guidance counselors for things like that. He didn't go to school very much, and he didn't have to do Latin grammar drills or Greek philosophy seminars, which should have made him less smart. It somehow set him free instead. Leonardo learned by poking things in the real world with a stick until they told him what they were hiding. At night, he cut open dead bodies to learn about anatomy. That's completely normal. He learned physics by dropping things from high places. Still, normal, and taught himself engineering by sketching out devices that looked like they might break OSHA rules. His notebooks, which were thousands of pages long, read like the diary of a man whose curiosity had been turned into a weapon. There are diagrams of flying machines, dissections of eyeballs, sketches of flow dynamics, war machines, botanical studies, and of course a grocery list written in mirror script, because Leonardo thought being normal was against the law. It was a mess to work with Leonardo. People hired him to paint, and he would eventually, but only after making 2 musical instruments, redesigning the sewage system in his city, and taking a 5-month break to learn about how laughter works. It was up to the artist whether or not to finish their paintings. It was necessary to learn everything. You can't have Leonardo's inventions without his craziness. He wasn't making the world a better place. He was daring it to a fight. Every event, thing, and law of nature was just another thing to outsmart, outdraw, or quietly insult, by way of engineering. And that's how every Leonardo invention starts, with a man who looked at life and said, "You know what? I can take care of this." Leonardo da Vinci was obsessed with many things, but none were as doomed, grand, or dangerous to his health as his dream of flying. Birds made fun of him, not on purpose, birds were just going about their business. Leonardo, on the other hand, took it personally. He watched them fly through the sky with ease and thought to himself, yes, I will do this too. Only medieval materials and strong legs. This is how the ornithopter came to be. It was a flying machine that the pilot powered with their arms, legs, back, hope, and every muscle group that humans were never meant to use at the same time. It had huge, beautifully drawn wings that looked like bats, eagles, and other things that Leonardo studied while definitely not meeting deadlines. To use it, you would strap yourself into a wooden frame that looked like a torture rack from the Renaissance, and then use ropes, levers, and other tools to flap the wings. And being blindly hopeful, Leonardo didn't say who he thought would be able to fly this thing, but it had to be someone with thighs strong enough to crush marble columns, like Hercules. So, in short, no one was alive in 1490. But there is no denying the brilliance behind the madness. Leonardo knew about lift, drag, center of gravity, and how air flows long before people stopped thinking. Angry gods ruled the sky. His notes weren't the crazy scribbles of a madman. They were the basic parts of aeronautical engineering. He watched how birds move their wings, how the wind moves, and how turbulence forms. Then he made diagrams so detailed that even modern scientists still nod in respect before saying, also, this would kill you right away. The biggest problem with the design wasn't Leonardo's math. It was the truth about how the body works. On a bad day, people can barely lift grocery bags, let alone flap themselves into the sky while holding on to a wooden death trap. Leonardo didn't think about two things enough. Gravity hates people who want to do well, and the average Florentine's heart rate. But even though no one in the Renaissance ever flew with Leonardo's wings like a bird, unless you count flying for half a second before hitting the ground, the idea was new and exciting. The ornithopter was not a failed idea. It was a prophecy. Leonardo didn't make the first successful airplane, but he did draw the first plan that made it possible. Aviation possible. That's what genius does in the end. It falls, crashes, and burns so that someone else can fly 400 years later. Leonardo da Vinci had a brave thought. People were going to fall from great heights anyway, and let's face it, they were. They might as well do it in style and with a lower chance of death. He made the first known parachute in the world. It was a pyramid-shaped structure made of tightly woven linen stretched over a wooden frame. Think of a tent. Now think about someone who wants to, going down from a tower while wearing that tent. That's the parachute that Leonardo uses. He confidently wrote in his notes, "A man with this device shall throw himself down from any great height without injury." This is a very poetic way of saying, I haven't tried this yet, but I'm sure it'll be fine. The design itself is impressive. 4 long wooden poles come together at the top, and linen is stretched out like a giant funnel. There is a platform underneath for the unlucky volunteer. It should work in theory. In real life, it needs someone who is willing to climb a very tall building when most people pass out from standing up too quickly. But here's the catch. Leonardo wasn't completely crazy. His parachute should have worked, and modern engineers who rebuilt it showed that. In 2000, a skydiver named Adrian Nicholas made a copy out of Renaissance materials, jumped with it, and lived. He said the landing was smooth, which is something Leonardo would have loved to hear 500 years ago. We still need to understand the level of arrogance it takes to design something that will break your fall from a deadly height before anyone even thought of the term terminal velocity. People in the Renaissance didn't trust ladders very much. Leonardo, on the other hand, was casually telling people to throw themselves off towers with a linen house on their backs. But one thing that Leonardo knew better than anyone else was how air resistance worked. His notes show that he knew drag slows down descent long before there were any physics books. He even drew pictures of experiments with things that fall to see then how the air cushion works. And all of this was done without calculators, wind tunnels, or the basic safety instinct that most people have. Leonardo's parachute was more than just a tool. It was a message. Things that go up must come down, but not right away. He thought of a world where people could get away from burning towers, falling bridges, or engineering experiments that went wrong. Was it useful for his time? No way. Was it smart? No doubt about it, as long as you weren't the volunteer who was testing it. You thought Leonardo's obsession with flying couldn't get any crazier, but then he came up with something even bigger: the screw in the air, the first helicopter in the world that was just an idea. Imagine a huge screw made of linen and wooden ribs that looks like a cone that spirals. Now picture 4 Renaissance men standing around it, grabbing poles and spinning it hard enough to lift a platform into the air. This sounds like a bad idea, and that's because it really was. The aerial screw looks great on paper. Before physics did, Leonardo knew how lift worked. He figured out that a spiral structure that spun quickly could push air down and the machine up. This is how real helicopters work, in fact. The issue is that helicopters need an engine. Italy during the Renaissance didn't have engines. Italy during the Renaissance hardly had any good socks. Leonardo's answer was people, which is funny because the average Florentine in the 15th century was very strong. The strength of a baguette. These were people who fell down while walking up a hill. But Leonardo thought they could spin a 500-pound flying corkscrew fast enough to escape gravity. The math didn't add up, the physics didn't work, and the materials, well, linen and pine wood aren't known for being strong enough for space travel. But here's the smart part. Leonardo did find out what the main idea behind vertical flight was. He had the idea, but not the power. He drew pictures of the aerial screw that show layers of technical detail, load distribution, spiral geometry, force transfer through rotational torque, airflow compression, all without using calculators, books, or safety rules. This was a mix of raw intelligence and pure fantasy. The engineers who rebuilt it in the modern era said the same thing. It does work if you replace people with a small engine and the whole structure with aerospace-grade materials. You're basically saying that the idea is brilliant. The act of killing is homicide. You have to give them credit for being so bold. Leonardo didn't want just gliders or wings. He didn't want to act like birds. He wanted to copy the sky itself, a machine that went up and down, like a divine mechanical dragonfly hovering over the ground. Of course, it never flew. The original aerial screw only lifted people's eyebrows, but the idea lived on. And hundreds of years later, helicopters came into being, not from trial and error, but from the mind of a man who wouldn't let gravity control him. Leonardo da Vinci thought that if people couldn't rule the skies yet, they might as well rule the water. He literally looked down and came up with one of the first diving suits in the world. At this time, most people were afraid of the ocean, didn't trust fish, and thought that anything underwater was either a demon or a mermaid trying to avoid paying taxes. But Leonardo saw a chance to make a smart move. It was strange and ambitious to make his diving suit. Picture a leather bodysuit sewn together, along with Renaissance craftsmanship, which means it's strong but a little scary. The face mask had 2 glass eye windows that probably fogged up right away, making it impossible for the diver to see anything. Long tubes that went up to a floating air bell at the surface were used to help people breathe. That sounds weak, but it was one strong wave. And all of a sudden, you're not looking at the enemy ship. You're looking at St. Peter. The suit wasn't made for snorkeling for fun. Journeys. It was meant to be used for secret naval sabotage. Leonardo thought that divers could swim under enemy ships, make holes in the hull, and then get away without anyone noticing while the ship slowly sank. It was basically Renaissance special operations, but with less training and a higher chance of drowning. And, as always, Leonardo thought of everything, even a small pouch on the front of the suit for tools or maybe stolen snacks. He even wrote a part in his notes about how a diver might feel threatened and hide at the bottom of the sea and wait out the danger with a reserve of air. This was brave of him, since people his age thought the ocean was just a haunted soup. The diving suit is so interesting because it could really work. Long before scuba tanks or regulators were invented, Leonardo knew how to get air, pressure, and mobility underwater. His mind wasn't the problem, it was the technology of the day. Leather, glass, and cloth tubes were not the best materials for long missions underwater. Most divers would have lasted about 10 minutes before the ocean politely took them out of the gene pool. Leonardo didn't care, though. He didn't want to be practical. He was trying to make things possible. It wasn't just an idea that he came up with. It was a statement that the sea, no matter how big and scary it was just another puzzle that needed to be solved. Leonardo da Vinci's one flaw was that he couldn't stop himself from wanting to redesign war. A patron asks for a painting. Leonardo gives a plan for a nightmare on the battlefield. A customer asks for a statue. Leonardo suggests a platform for a cannon that can spin and wipe out a small village. The armored tank was the best part of this habit, an invention that was so ahead of its time that people in the 15th century looked at it like it had just insulted their mother. Imagine a huge metal tortoise rolling across the battlefield, covered in curved armor plates and with cannons arranged in a perfect circle. Inside this turtle of war, a group of soldiers were turning gears to move the huge machine forward, which gives you a good idea of what the first floor looked like. No one was ready to drive a tank powered by a heart during the Renaissance. Bread, cheese, and the occasional plague outbreak don't give you the thighs you need to push a mobile death dome uphill. It was crazy and brilliant how Leonardo designed it. The slanted armor would bounce off arrows, stones, and maybe even insults. The way the inside was set up kept the crew safe from enemy fire, while also letting them shoot in any direction they wanted. It was basically a medieval press this button to ruin everyone's day machine. Anyone who saw it on the battlefield would quickly rethink their life choices, their alliances, and maybe even their underwear. But this is where Leonardo's genius starts to look suspicious. The gear system he drew was backwards, like it was turned inside out. It wouldn't move forward if you built the tank exactly how he drew it. It wouldn't even turn. It would sit there like an angry armored cookie. Historians have argued about whether this was a real mistake or a sneaky act of sabotage. Leonardo said he was against war for moral reasons, even though he made enough weapons to start a few wars. Some people think he flipped the gears on purpose so that no warlord could use his invention without first fixing the plans. If so, it was the most passive-aggressive anti-war protest in the history of engineering. Even if the gear problem was fixed, no blacksmith from the Middle Ages could have made enough light, strong metal to build this monster. Gunpowder was needed for cannons. Making armor took skill. Wheels had to stay up. The Renaissance just didn't have the manufacturing power to make this beast come to life. But the idea was very real. Leonardo didn't make the first working tank, but he imagined it so clearly that later engineers basically said, "Yes, let's do this." His armored tank wasn't built for battle 400 years later. It was made to warn people, tell them what would happen in the future, and remind them that Leonardo was always hundreds of years ahead of everyone else, like a toddler who doesn't know what to do. At some point in Leonardo's career, he saw a normal-sized crossbow and thought, yes, but what if this could level a small town? This led to one of his most theatrical inventions, the giant crossbow, which is also known as the ballista on performance-enhancing drugs. It was about the size of a small house, which makes sense because shooting at once could probably destroy a few cottages. The map. It was 40 feet wide, and its limbs were so big that it took a whole squad of soldiers to pull the string back. The bow arms were made of laminated wood that was strengthened like a battering ram, and the main firing track was long enough to shoot bolts as big as telephone poles. Leonardo thought it would throw stones, flaming barrels, or big bolts at enemy formations, all with a dramatic flair that showed he cared a lot about how the battlefield looked. You can easily picture the moment. 2. Armies looking at each other. The air was full of tense silence. Then someone brings out a crossbow that is so big it could be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. One side's morale goes up. On the other hand, morale packs its bags and leaves. But like many of Leonardo's other inventions, genius fought with usefulness and quickly lost when it came to building. This horrible thing would have needed more wood than most forests could politely give, as well as carpenters who didn't pass out halfway through building it and getting it to A. Battlefield. Don't worry about it. You would need a group of oxmen, a few wagons, and maybe even help from God. Even if you could put it together, the loading process would take so long that your enemies could just walk around it, take a nap, and come back ready to fight. Then there's the way it fires. Leonardo thought of a complicated tension and release system, but with Renaissance materials, this meant hoping the string didn't break and take off someone's head. The thought of the giant crossbow is the best of Leonardo, a mix of genius, fear, and designer chaos. He wanted war to be not only useful, but also beautiful. If you were going to kill your enemies, you might as well do it with a siege weapon on steroids from the Renaissance. And even though there is no record of this beast being built in history, its presence in Leonardo's notebooks shows something important. The man had no idea what was too much for him. War machines weren't just tools. They were words, statements that are loud, silly, and scary. Leonardo da Vinci looked at battlefield muskets long before anyone came up with the phrase rapid fire. He thought they were too slow and was tired of watching soldiers shoot once, reload for 8 hours, and then die before finishing the process. So he came up with the 33-barreled organ, the first conceptual machine gun, which made him the most dangerous efficiency expert of the Renaissance. This wasn't really a gun. It was more of a complaint. Made real, Leonardo thought, if one musket is good, then 33 muskets fused into one unholy instrument must be better. So he made a scary machine that looked like a deadly pipe organ, with rows of barrels set up like a fan that could fire almost at the same time. The idea was easy to understand. Instead of one soldier firing one shot at a time, a group of soldiers would move this huge weapon into place and fire a volley so strong that it would make the enemy question every choice they made that led them to that point, battlefield. After firing, the whole set of barrels could be turned backward so that the next set, which was already loaded, could fit into place. Reloading turned into a chaotic conveyor belt. It was great, scary, and as safe as juggling torches in a gunpowder warehouse. It wasn't Leonardo's creativity that was the main problem. It was physics, metallurgy, and the fact that weapons tended to blow up in the user's face in the 15th century. Muskets of the time had a hard time not bursting after one shot. Think about firing 33 at once. The only thing that was certain was that someone was losing eyebrows. Then there was the heaviness. It took a small group of soldiers to pull the machine gun into battle because it was so heavy, and by the time they got it set up, the enemy might have already moved, had lunch, and gone home. Still, the main idea was very modern. Leonardo knew that being in charge on the battlefield didn't mean being able to reload faster. It was about never stopping. He thought about the idea of continuous fire hundreds of years before anyone else. His drawings clearly show how air flows around the barrels to keep them from getting too hot. how the recoil is spread out, and how the firing patterns are meant to clear infantry lines like sweeping crumbs off a table. It wasn't built during his lifetime, mostly because no one in the Renaissance was brave enough or had the life insurance to try it. But the ideas behind it led to what we now call machine warfare. Not only did Leonardo speed up the battle, he thought of it again and again, each time with a volley that was dangerously unstable. Leonardo da Vinci sat in his workshop and quietly declared war on the whole equine industry. In a world where everything depended on horses, like farming, transportation, and social status, and the occasional dramatic exit, this was a big deal. Why depend on a living thing that has feelings, thoughts, and a habit of kicking people when you could make a machine that moved on its own? So the self-propelled cart was born. It was the first conceptual car for humans, as long as you didn't mind steering a vehicle that was powered only by springs and hopefulness in the Renaissance. The cart seemed harmless enough. It was a wooden platform on 3 wheels with gears hidden underneath. But Leonardo's mechanical tricks were hidden inside. A set of coiled springs that, when wound up, released enough stored energy to make the cart roll forward on its own. There were no horses or drivers, just pure Da Vinci chaos on wheels. Historians think it was first made for plays where props or actors would roll across the stage, either too important or too lazy to walk. But since I know Leonardo, this was just the polite way to say it. He definitely built it to show that people could control motion without using animals. This was the 15th century version of cars, which are a symbol of modern freedom. A wooden shopping cart that ran away as soon as you stopped looking at it. Of course, things got interesting when it came to steering. Leonardo's cart had differential gears, which was a very advanced idea for Renaissance engineers. Would have looked at it the same way people today look at tax forms. It meant that the wheels could turn at different speeds when they were going around a corner. Genius of the revolution. A wooden vehicle that looks like a breadboard is completely unnecessary. Researchers today made a working copy, and it worked. It moved. It turned. It acted like a toddler on roller skates. Not always predictable, but definitely on the move. It's both inspiring and a little scary to watch it roll across the room, like seeing a new technology come to life. That will eventually lead to road rage and traffic jams. Leonardo's cart wasn't fast, useful, or even close to safe. It didn't have to be. It was only there to show that animals didn't need to move things. And in doing so, Leonardo unintentionally came up with the basic idea behind every car ever made. The world of the Renaissance wasn't ready. The roads weren't ready yet. There was no way the horses were ready. But the future had already begun to roll at one point in. During Leonardo's career, he decided that people just weren't dramatic enough. Fine, paintings, flying machines are cool, but it seems that the world really needed a robotic knight, a fully mechanical warrior made to scare enemies, impress nobles, and maybe even start the Renaissance version of a robot uprising. Leonardo's robot knight wasn't just a rough sketch or an idea that wasn't fully formed. In the late 1490s, he built the thing. While he was in Milan, he built a humanoid machine out of gears, a pulley, and metal plates. This mechanical soldier could sit, stand, raise its arms, and move its jaw. That's pretty cool, since most real knights couldn't do those things without help from three squires and a chiropractor. The design was based on Leonardo's own studies of the human body. He cut up bodies to learn about muscles and tendons, and then he used mechanical analogs to copy those movements. He put a system of cables where a bicep would normally be. Where joints turned, he put in precise, engineered gears. The robot's body was like a human's, but it didn't complain, sweat, or get sick. Historians think that Leonardo made the robot in part to amuse the Duke of Milan's court. Think about it. There was a big banquet with nobles drinking wine and musicians playing lutes. Then, out of nowhere, a metal knight rises from the floor as if it were auditioning for a Renaissance talent show. People must have screamed, clapped, passed out, or all three. People in this time thought comets were. The sight of a mechanical man probably made at least one monk question everything he believed in. But the robot was more than just a party trick. It showed that Leonardo knew how people moved long before robotics or biomechanics were around. He wasn't just copying muscles, he was designing movement. His notebooks have ideas that are shockingly modern, like feedback systems, joint articulation, and layered gear assemblies. This wasn't a joke, it was the beginning of automation. The Duke never used the robot in real-life fights. It was too valuable, too experimental, and too likely to fall over if a bird sneezed near it. But the truth is that Leonardo was the first person to design a robot that looked like a person, a knight who could walk, talk, and use gears long before electricity was invented. Leonardo didn't just think about machines. He wanted to live in a world of machines. That should worry all of us. After surviving outbreaks of the plague, bad leadership, and city layouts that looked like a toddler's scribbles, Leonardo da Vinci made a brave decision. People shouldn't be able to design their own homes. People were dirty. The streets were dirty canals. It was up to you whether or not to clean up. And every medieval city smelled like stress, sewage, and garlic. So Leonardo did what he always did when he was let down by reality. He started over and redesigned it. So his perfect city came to be. A plan so advanced and well organized that the Renaissance wasn't even close to being ready for it. Leonardo saw clean streets and efficient transportation, better drainage systems, open plazas, and buildings with more than one floor. Yes, he wanted cities with levels. One for people, one for carts, one for trash and water. He basically came up with the idea of zoning hundreds of years before anyone thought it might be a bad idea to store dead animals next to bakeries. The idea of beauty through function was at the heart of Leonardo's vision. The buildings were the same on both sides. Ventilation was done on purpose. People didn't have to move moldy curtains to let light into their homes. His canals would be changed and built to stop flooding, which would put an end to the fun seasonal activity of watching your things float away. He even suggested wide streets, which were unheard of in medieval Europe, where roads were usually only one donkey wide and full of dangers that made them feel like obstacle courses. Leonardo wanted wide streets so that air could flow, sunlight could come in, and people could move around easily. It's as if he knew that one day people would freak out if they were stuck in traffic for more than 3 minutes. But of course, there was a problem. Actually, a few. First, Leonardo's perfect city needed smart leaders. That was enough to kill it. Renaissance leaders wanted shiny statues and frescoes, not better roads and bridges. Second, it needed money, and people in the Renaissance usually spent their money on wars, weddings, and sometimes very unnecessary banquets. Third, his designs were so good that they were almost like alien technology. It was like asking a medieval baker to make this for you. A Tesla. So, the perfect city was still a dream, ink on paper, hundreds of years ahead of its time. When modern city planners see Leonardo's blueprints, they feel both admiration and an existential crisis because we are still trying to put into action everything he suggested. Grid systems, managing sewage, streets that people can walk on, and planning buildings up and down. Before door hinges were made the same, Leonardo figured it all out. It's not sad that no one built Leonardo's perfect city. The sad thing is that we still, not yet. Leonardo da Vinci was very good at finding things that bothered him, like rivers. Crossing water always slowed down medieval armies. Leonardo hated it when things didn't work right. So he came up with the revolving bridge, a portable, collapsible engineering marvel made for armies that needed to move quickly, strike without warning, and probably break a few natural laws along the way. The idea was nice, a bridge that could be folded up, carried, put into action, and taken down faster than an enemy could say. What? Where did they come from? Leonardo thought of a light wooden structure with a smart hinge and pivot system. A group of soldiers could carry it like a big ladder, throw it across a river, march over it in perfect formation, and then pull it back up behind them before anyone knew what had happened. It was a logistical nightmare. Quick, on the move, and a little rude to anyone trying to catch up. This wasn't just a board with an attitude. Leonardo's bridge had counterweights to keep the span stable, locking mechanisms to keep it in place, and a base that could be turned so that it could be set up at different angles. It was basically a Renaissance version of a now you see us, now you don't game. It could make armies show up where they shouldn't, disappear where they shouldn't, and completely confuse any general who didn't have Leonardo on speed dial. Of course, the genius of the revolving bridge also brought out a big idea in Leonardo's life. Life. He was making things for people who weren't ready for them. The average soldier in the 1500s had trouble with simple things like not dropping their pike. Now picture asking them to carry a folding bridge that was made with precision without breaking anything or themselves. It is not clear if Leonardo ever tried this out with real soldiers, but the chances of them putting it together correctly the first time were about the same as the chances of a chicken reading Latin correctly. Still, the turning. The bridge was hundreds of years ahead of its time. Modern armies use deployable bridges that work on the same ideas: portability, speed, and let's get across this before the enemy figures out we shouldn't. Leonardo didn't just suggest a new tool, he came up with a whole new way of thinking about movement. But like many of his other inventions, the revolving bridge was stuck in the limbo between a brilliant idea and I don't know how to build that. His customers wanted flashy weapons, not tools that could help them solve problems. Needed brains and skill. Still, the bridge is one of Leonardo's most pure works. Smart, effective, a little confusing, and way better than anything the Renaissance was ready for. When Leonardo da Vinci first saw the printing press, people in Europe were already going crazy over this new invention that let people write down their thoughts without needing a monk who could write faster than a human life. Most scholars praised the press as a great achievement in knowledge, literacy, and talking to each other. Leonardo, on the other hand, looked at it and thought, cute, but it could be better. This is what makes Leonardo different from everyone else. People who aren't in the printing business see a printing press as a machine that makes books. When Leonardo sees a printing press, he sees a prototype that isn't very good and needs to be taken apart, rebuilt, and made into something that will scare publishers. First, he didn't like how slowly typesetting was, moving small metal letters around by hand, boring, takes a long time, and doesn't work well. Leonardo had seen scribes copy manuscripts before. He could tell when something was not working well. So he started drawing up plans for mechanisms, gears, rotating platforms, and automated type frames that he thought would speed up the whole thing. What's the problem? Renaissance printers weren't ready. Most of them didn't even know how to use the machine they already had. Now Leonardo is suggesting a system that would need a lot of engineers, a stable power source that didn't exist, and the patience of a saint. It was like giving bakers in the Middle Ages a recipe for a chocolate soule and hoping it would turn out well. But Leonardo kept going. He came up with a rotating system that made it easier to switch out prearranged type blocks, which let printers move from one page layout to the next with mechanical accuracy. He wanted things to move faster, work more smoothly, and even though he never said it directly, he wanted all slow printing to stop. If publishers in the Renaissance had used, if Leonardo had made improvements, Europe might have entered the information age 200 years earlier. But they didn't. When printers saw his beautifully drawn gears, they thought about what they could do and all agreed, no thank you, we don't want to explode. That was the end of it. Leonardo did other things after that: anatomy, flight, hydraulics, and the printing press, which worked at a steady, unchanging pace. But the irony is so good. Leonardo's thoughts, foreshadowed automation, fast typesetting, industrial presses, and even the machines used by newspapers today. He didn't just think of ways to make things better. He also thought of whole new industries that would come about because he thought books deserved better. And because Leonardo was Leonardo, he couldn't leave anything alone. Long before antibiotics, surgical gloves, and doctors stopped telling people to take random herbs and pray, Leonardo da Vinci walked into anatomy with the same confidence as a man who wasn't afraid of getting sick, but of being ignorant. Leonardo was like a Renaissance medical detective who only worked at night for dramatic effect. While most doctors were using old, dusty books written hundreds of years ago, he was cutting open bodies and finding the truth for himself. Leonardo's studies of anatomy were not just vague sketches. They were plans for how to build machines that looked like people. He didn't just write down how things looked, he wrote down how they worked. Muscles weren't shapes, they were wheels. Joints were not bones, they were hinges. The heart didn't mean love, there was a hydraulic pump. He walked up to the body like an engineer, taking apart God's most complicated machine, probably whispering, "Okay, but why did you do it this way?" Leonardo wasn't just curious, he was also dangerous. It was correct. Even today, surgeons admire his drawings of the spine, shoulder joints, and facial muscles because they are so accurate. In a time when a lot of doctors still thought that humor was bad for you, people thought that demons caused toothaches or that nightmares caused them. Leonardo's drawings were hundreds of years ahead of their time. He even figured out how heart valves worked, a discovery that Western medicine didn't officially confirm until the 20th century because no one else had thought to look. But Leonardo's mechanical models, which some historians call his anatomy machines, were the real wonders. He made systems of gears, levers, and cranks that worked like limbs, lungs, and blood. These weren't playthings, they were early. Prototypes of biomechanics and robotics that were made when most people still thought the body was full of vapors and maybe a squirrel. Leonardo was doing more than just watching nature. He was taking it apart and putting it back together again. The church didn't like this at all. People didn't like it when people cut up dead bodies, and doing it with enthusiasm was basically a job risk. Leonardo didn't pay attention to this and kept going because when something interested him, not even the Vatican could stop him. His machines for anatomy were not made to impress customers or warlords. They were made to understand what it means to be alive. And maybe, just maybe, to show that Leonardo da Vinci, who didn't have a medical degree, knew more about the human body than any doctor alive. Leonardo da Vinci's death in 1519 did not leave behind a simple legacy. He left behind a 13,000-page problem for all the historians, scientists, and engineers who came after him. Most people die and leave behind clothes, furniture, and maybe a box under the bed that looks suspicious. Leonardo left behind plans for weapons, flight experiments, anatomical diagrams, city planning, blueprints, studies of robots, research on optics, and enough unfinished projects to make it a fire hazard in the Renaissance. His notebooks read like the universe downloaded all of its secrets into one man's head, but it only gave him 67 years to write them all down. Leonardo clearly needed at least 3 lifetimes. He only finished a few paintings because he was too busy figuring out how rivers work, redesigning musical instruments, and making things better. Military strategy and casually change biology. He would have won the gold medal in procrastination and then engraved it, redesigned it, and forgotten where he put it. But he didn't really invent the flying machine. the tank, the robot knight, or the underwater sabotage suit. A method was Leonardo's last work of art. The notion that the world functions as a machine, intricate, aesthetically pleasing, and imperfect, inviting anyone with sufficient curiosity to deconstruct and reconstruct an improved iteration. Renaissance. Saints were painted by artists. Leonardo painted how the world works on the inside. What makes him so scary is that he wasn't just ahead of his time. He was ahead of many times. His studies of anatomy predicted medical knowledge 300 years ahead of time. His ideas about machines were a sign of things to come in the world of industrial automation. His drawings of airplanes came before aerodynamics. His plans for cities look more like modern city planning than anything else from the 15th century. Leonardo was alive in 1500, but he went to the year in his mind, 2500, and brought back gifts, but his death was quiet and without any fuss. There was no big recognition, no headlines around the world, and no Renaissance Genius Award, just a guy in a room full of notebooks that no one else could read yet. A mind so big that the world had to grow for hundreds of years to catch up. And maybe that's the point. Leonardo didn't make things that would last for his own lifetime. He was leaving clues for the future. Signals, clues, and blueprints were meant for people who weren't smart enough to use them yet. With care, Leonardo da Vinci didn't just make machines in the end. He came up with the idea of possibility, and the chance never dies. It holds off. It gets bigger. It comes back, just like Leonardo himself. If you could go back in time to a medieval tournament for even a second, the first thing you would hear wouldn't be the clang of steel or the roar of the crowd. It would be the color, a violent explosion of silk, velvet, gold leaf, feathers, embroidery, and heraldic animals that were so big they looked like they were going to jump off the fabric and join the fight. Before a single lance broke, the field was already a fashion battleground, and everyone knew it. Tournaments were more than just practice for the military. They were carefully planned shows of status. Knights didn't just ride into the lists to show off how strong they were. They rode to make themselves known. Every piece of clothing, every painted shield, and every plume that moved on a helmet sent a message. Wealth, family, loyalty, personality, and sometimes, yes, I am richer. And Gregory, you're more sparkly than you. Get over it. In the Middle Ages, a knight's surcoat was like a custom luxury suit and a billboard all in one, a bright blue color for a noble house that is connected to the sea, red for a family that is said to have a bad temper, gold thread for those who wanted to remind the peasants watching that they would never be that rich. Some knights even put little bells or metal studs on their armor, not to protect themselves, but so that it would jingle dramatically when they walked. Imagine walking into battle and hoping everyone hears you coming. And it wasn't just the knights. Their horses were like famous people. Comparisons. Everything from embroidered vines to roaring lions was used to decorate full-body cloth coverings. Some were so heavily decorated that the poor horse underneath looked like it was dressed up as a moving tapestry. The more detailed the comparison, the more people whispered, Who is that? What house is that? How many people worked on that to sew it? Not even weapons were, not given the glamour treatment. Painted animals, geometric shapes, or religious symbols made shields shine. Helmets grew plumes, wings, dragon crests, and sometimes shapes that were so silly that even the medieval artists who drew them looked confused. Yes, tournaments were dangerous, but they were also a test of creativity, like a medieval fashion week where the runway could break your ribs. In this world, winning didn't start a good reputation. It started the moment you walked into the sun and let the colors do the talking. Before every hit and every charge, the first battle was always fought with pride, fabric, and feathers. The coyote, a long, flowing, and often very expensive piece of cloth worn over a knight's armor, was the most important piece of clothing at a medieval tournament. It seems rude to call it clothing. This thing was a statement, a declaration, and sometimes a cry for attention so loud that it could drown out the trumpeters. The circuit had two main tasks. First, keep the sun from turning metal armor into a medieval oven. Second, show off. And the show off part became its whole personality. Imagine a knight riding into the lists with a surcoat behind him like a comet from space. Rich blues dyed with imported woe, deep crimsons pressed from thousands of crushed insects, and gold thread braided in patterns that only a noble's wallet could afford. It wasn't only about style, it was politics sewn right into the fabric. A man's seer told you everything before. He even raised his visor, his family, his friends, his enemies, and how badly he wanted attention that day. Each house had its own heraldic colors, which knights proudly wore. If your family had a boar as a symbol, you wore boar designs. If it was a lion, good job. You probably fit in with a lot of the nobility. But some families had creative coats of arms. These ended up being embroidered with a lot of glittering detail, along with geese, snails, and hedgehogs. A knight charging at full speed with a sword is the best way to make someone fear you. Giant golden goose flapping across his chest. And the material wasn't subtle either. Velvet, silk, brocade, fabrics that absolutely did not belong anywhere near a man wielding a lance. Some sirets were so heavy with embellishments that they flapped like miniature tents in the wind. Others were cut shorter to avoid tangling in armor joints, giving knights a strangely fashionable silhouette somewhere between armed warrior and runway model mid-twirl. Even more amusing were the knights who treated their surcoat like a moral shield. Religious knights decorated theirs with saints, holy symbols, or entire embroidered Bible verses, as if a beautifully stitched angel on your chest would somehow convince your opponent's lance to miss. But the real drama came from spectators. A knight with a dull or cheap-looking surcoat whispered insults, a knight with a spectacular one. Marriage prospects suddenly doubled. The surcoat wasn't just outerwear, it was medieval social currency, because in a world where one good hit could knock you, the surcoat was the outfit, and heraldry was the personality. You couldn't go to a medieval tournament without being hit in the face with a mountain of symbols: lions, eagles, bow, fleur-de-lis, suns, moons, crosses, unicorns, and whatever else a noble family thought would show off their eternal glory. Heraldry was like branding and astrology combined. It was part identity, part reputation, and part my ancestors. It seems like he liked birds. Every night, he entered the lists behind a huge banner that could be seen from across the field. Medieval tournaments were bright, bold, and unapologetically dramatic, and they were also chaotic, dusty, and loud. So the answer was simple: make the symbols huge. Heraldry almost looked like medieval graphic designers trying to yell, "This is Gerald of Gloucester." Do not mix him up with Gerald of Gloucester's cousin, who has 2 lions instead of 1. Symbolism was important. Lions stood for bravery, even if the knight fainted when his horse sneezed too loudly. Bears stood for strength, though some families chose bears just because they thought they looked cool. Eagles stood for nobility. Dragons stood for families who liked to scare their neighbors without actually doing anything scary. And then, of course, there were snails. Yes, entire noble lineages proudly marched under banners featuring heroic snails. Historians still cannot figure out why. Colors had meaning too. Blue, red, meant warrior spirit. Gold meant generosity. Or more honestly, we have enough money to waste gold dye on cloth. And black could mean wisdom, grief, or simply, my tailor had a sale. Each combination told a story that was meant to impress the crowd, inspire allies, and scare rivals. Heraldic shields were painted with the same care as holy books. Some were so intricate that they looked like portable stained glass windows strapped to a knight's arm. Others were very simple and funny. One animal, one background color, and no hesitation. The message was clear. I am here to hit someone very hard, not to confuse them with too many design elements. And heraldry wasn't just for knights. Even horses wore heraldic cloth, making whole teams look like coordinated fashion statements. A noble family with matching sir, banners, and horse comparisons looked like a medieval boy band arriving on tour. Dramatic, unified, and dangerously committed to their aesthetic. In tournaments where dozens of armored men crashed together, and heraldry was the only thing that kept things from getting completely out of hand. It was identity, pride, legacy, and the medieval world's most daring show of the strength. If the coyote was the outfit and heraldry was the identity, then the shield was the medieval equivalent of a personalized billboard, but one that was meant to stop spears and look great while doing it. Shields at tournaments weren't the grim, battered slabs you see in battle reenactments. They were masterpieces, art pieces, ego boosters, and sometimes subtle threats disguised as decoration. The shield was usually the first thing the crowd saw up close. When the knight rode forward to salute the stands, the shield angled toward the nobles like a glamorous greeting card, and it mattered. A beautifully painted shield wasn't just decoration, it was a public relations campaign. A mud-splattered, chipped, unimpressive shield was social death. Most shields were kite shields or heater shields, both of which had a lot of surface area. Area for artistic overindulgence. Craftsmen layered pigments, metal leaf, lacquer, and varnish until the entire shield gleamed like a divine relic. Lions snarled across the wood grain. Eagles spread their wings in defiance. Dragons coiled dramatically as if ready to leap out and start an argument. And then there were the more eccentric designs: hands holding swords, flowers with eyes, geometric spirals that made spectators quietly wonder if the painter had gotten into the monastery's wine supply. But shields weren't just painted, they were curated. Some knights commissioned the equivalent of limited edition designs for specific tournaments. A feud with another house. Time to paint a bold, not at all subtle symbol to taunt them, trying to impress a noble woman watching from the pavilions. Add her family colors discreetly on the edge, attempting to look more pious than the knight next to you. Cover the entire shield in a saint's glowing face and hope no one notices you skipped Mass that week. Then came the condition of the shield. A perfectly clean shield showed confidence. I don't think this will get hit. A shield that was gently worn showed experience. I've been through things you can't even imagine. A shield that was heavily dented showed either bravery or recklessness, or maybe both. But in tournaments, dents were often polished or painted over. No one wanted to walk out looking like they lost a fight with a castle door. In the end, a knight's shield wasn't just protection, it was also a personal brand identity. Around planks of wood, it was meant to be seen, admired, feared, and whispered about, because while a lance could win the match, a magnificent shield won the crowd. If medieval tournaments had a single symbol of glorious impracticality, it was the helmet crest. Those towering, extravagant decorations, knights strapped onto their helmets, knowing full well that one strong breeze could knock them sideways. These crests were where fashion, pride, symbolism, and questionable engineering formed an unholy alliance. The idea was simple. The taller, brighter, and crazier your crest was, the more people paid attention to you. Knights walked into the lists with dragons, wings, bulls, boars, towers, suns, flowers, angelic halos, and sometimes shapes that even medieval writers couldn't figure out. You clearly weren't trying hard enough if at least one squire didn't whisper, "Is that safe?" when they saw your crest. Some crests were made from light wood, some from boiled leather, and a few people who wanted to be the best used real metal, because nothing says, "I value aesthetics over spinal comfort," like bolting a steel dragon to your head. These works of art were painted in bright colors, covered in gold leaf, decorated with feathers so big they looked like they came from mythical birds, and sometimes had tiny gemstones set into them. It wasn't silly for a knight to charge into battle with a helmet with a jewel-encrusted unicorn horn on it. He was in style. Crests also helped people stand out. A house that is known for being brave might choose a lion that roars. Head. A family that was known for winning naval battles might wear a carved ship, which would have been very confusing for the horse. Some knights even chose crests that showed off their own unique traits. One historian writes about a knight who entered a tournament with a frying pan attached to his helmet as a joke. Another one had a crest that looked like a cabbage, which could mean humility or hunger. But the real show came when these pretty sculptures had to stand up to the wind from a galloping horse. Crests. They would wobble, flop, twist sideways, or even fly into the crowd like medieval frisbees. If a crest made it through the whole course without breaking, the knight was praised, not for skill, but for luck and balance. In the meantime, squires spent their days running after feathers that had run away, like seagulls that were being chased in the Middle Ages. Crests were important, even though they were weak. They were statements of status, bravery, and showmanship. A knight without a crest seemed incomplete. A knight with a beautiful crest looked like a legend. And a knight whose crest caught fire from a torch nearby. At least the story lived on. In tournaments that were all about show, the helmet crest was the crown of chaos, and knights wore it with pride. If helmet crests were the tournament's architectural wonders, plumes were the fireworks, colorful, dramatic, completely unnecessary, and loved by everyone. Medieval plumes didn't sound elegant. They yelled it from across the field. A knight with a huge plume of feathers on his head didn't look like a warrior, more like a proud peacock who had taken up jousting as a hobby. Medieval Europe got feathers from every impressive bird it could find. Swans, ostriches, peacocks, herons, and cranes. People respected you more if you had a big, rare bird. Putting on goose feathers. Okay. Wearing dyed ostrich feathers that are as big as a broom. That was status. Some knights even brought in feathers from the Middle East to show off how rich and worldly they were before they were sure to get killed. Horse. Plumes weren't just stuck on helmets at random. They kept up with trends, styles, and even seasonal tastes. Two plumes that pointed backward showed how fast something was going. A long plume going straight up showed confidence or hope. Three plumes meant, my tailor told me this makes my face look thinner, and plumes dyed in intricate gradients meant, I'm here to win the beauty contest disguised as a joust. But plumes had one weakness: physics. Anyone who has ever worn a big hat on a windy, anyone can understand. Plumes didn't stay upright at full gallop. They flapped, snapped, twisted, and sometimes fell off completely, like chronicle ride of plumes that fell off during a charge and flew into the audience like startled birds. Picture yourself as a merchant in the Middle Ages, quietly eating roasted almonds when a knight's flaming red ostrich feather hits you in the face. But plumes did have a useful side. In theory, they helped people see knights from a distance. This was very helpful during fights where dozens of armored men ran into each other like angry pots and pans. Someone might yell, look for the one with the huge green plume. But the system fell apart as soon as half of the plumes fell off, got dirty, or mysteriously moved to another knight during the chaos. Feathers also had a deeper meaning. White plumes made people think of purity and goodness, even if the person wearing them wasn't. Scarlet plumes meant bravery or a need for attention. Black feathers hinted at sleepiness, drama, or a knight trying to. Looked mysterious because he lost last year and wanted to change his image. In the end, plumes turned every knight into a work of art that moved. Were they silly? Yes, for sure. But they made tournaments unforgettable, flashy, and very theatrical, just like medieval nobles wanted. If you think knights wore too many clothes, wait until you see their horses. Because medieval tournaments made sure that even the animals looked like they were from a noble family. The horse wasn't just a way to get around, it was a status symbol and a fashion accessory, a living canvas of heraldry and wealth. And a lot of horses walked into the lists wearing clothes that would make modern runway designers cry with envy. Start the comparison. A long piece of cloth that hung over the horse's whole body and often came close to the ground. These things turned horses into running tapestries made of silk, velvet, or brocade, which horses didn't care about at all. They were sewn, painted, and decorated until the poor animal looked. It looked like it was in a royal pageant instead of getting ready to dodge flying splinters from broken lances. It wasn't possible to avoid a comparison. It was a visual introduction to the knight that was made bigger by horsepower. If your sir showed your colors and your shield showed your symbol, the comparison screamed it from the rooftops. Some had huge roaring lions on them, while others had flirty patterns that looked like dinner plates. Some had geometric patterns that were so dizzying that people probably saw double when they looked at them. The horse ran by, and because the nobility of the Middle Ages liked to be dramatic, they added bells. Yes, tiny bells sewn along the edges made the knight and his horse jingle with every step. You clearly weren't rich enough if people didn't hear you before they saw you. Then there was the issue of heat. Horses get hot. Putting them in several kilograms of embroidered fabric was crazy. But nobles kept going. Chroniclers talk about horses sweating through their expensive clothes, while knights bragged about how many seamstresses worked on their armor. Of course, the horses didn't say anything, mostly because they couldn't complain. There was also a tactical side to the comparison. It hid the horse's muscles and how it moved. In a melee, this could make it hard for the other players to guess what the horse would do next. But let's be honest, the tactical value was only 2%. The other 98% was just for show. Some comparisons included matching plumes, tassels, or decorative headpieces called chamfrons, which made the horse look like a noble creature called forth from a manuscript that was lit up. The knight and horse were both fully dressed, and the crowd gasped at the sight. In the medieval tournament arena, looks were everything. People noticed, and not kindly, if you showed up with a plain horse. In this world of silk, color, and glory, your horse was part of your legend, and it deserved to shine just as much as you did. Before knights rode down the lists with their lances lowered, they got dressed for the event, and dressed is the right word. The armor used in tournaments was not the same worn in real battles, which was worn out and useful. No, jousting armor was high-end armor made with the same care that medieval nobles used to negotiate marriages, feuds, and buying questionable religious relics. The armor used in tournaments became its own art form. Knights wore thick pauldrons, reinforced breastplates, and special grandards. Big plates on the left shoulder to soak up the terrible. A lance from another man tried to turn your ribs into medieval confetti. But the armor wasn't just for protection, it was about status. The steel was polished until every curve shone like a mirror in the sun. Imagine that dozens of knights shone so brightly in the morning sun that people watching had to squint like they were looking at holy relics. Then came the decorative parts, because plain armor just wasn't enough. Engravers made intricate designs of twisting vines, jumping stags, growling lions, or other animals, not work on the plates. Gold and silver inlays showed family crests, religious symbols, or abstract designs that said, "Yes, I am rich enough to pay an artisan 10 days' wages to decorate my elbow." Some armor even had prayers etched into it in case divine intervention wanted to help on tournament day. Each piece had a little something extra. The vampresses on the forearms were often decorated with fancy ridges or scalloped edges, and the gauntlets had shiny embossed symbols on them, greaves and sabatons for the legs and feet. Armor sometimes had pointed toes that were so stylish and so easy to trip over that modern historians still wonder how knights didn't fall over like armored ducks. But the real star is the helm. Tournament helms were thicker, rounder, heavier, and not very breathable, like an iron oven. Knights looked through narrow slits that were about as clear as wearing a mailbox on your head. These helmets were also canvases for art, with gilded trim, painted visors, embossed crowns, and of course, the crazy bolt-on madness of feathers and crests. Even with all the fancy decorations, tournament armor was surprisingly useful in one way. It kept people from dying. Tournaments were risky. Lances broke, shields broke, horses ran into each other, and knights sometimes forgot to turn left instead of right. A good suit of armor could save a life and make the person wearing it look great while almost losing it. Armor wasn't just for protection in the medieval tournament. It was steel that combined style, identity, ego, and skill. The best mix of style and staying alive. A medieval tournament wasn't just a test of strength or skill. It was a public theater, a huge festival where clothes, armor, fabrics, feathers, horses, banners, and egos all came together in a huge show of aristocratic pageantry. This was like the Oscars, the Met Gala, and a demolition derby all rolled into one if there were award shows in the Middle Ages. People came to see the fashion show before the jousts even started, not to watch the fights. Nobles sat in pavilions under embroidered canopies, squinting with judgmental excitement. Women of high birth whispered about which knight had changed the colors of his heraldry and whose surcoat looked suspiciously less expensive. Of this year, and it was clear that he had hired a new tailor because his shape had changed a lot. Gossip in the Middle Ages was harsh. While the nobles gossiped, the commoners cheered for anything that was shiny. A knight could just ride by with the sun shining off his shiny breastplate, and peasants would cheer like they just saw a miracle. It didn't matter to them if the crest had a meaning, a history, or a symbol. They were worried that it looked big and maybe dangerous. There was music in the air, Trumpeters played music to signal each entrance, making the lists into a catwalk with a lively brass sound. With a lot of drama, heralds announced knights. Look at Sir Edmund of Renner. His bravery is only matched by the size of his plume. Banners flew, comparisons flew, and bells rang. Every sense was attacked. This wasn't a mistake. The goal of tournaments was to be as exciting as possible. Lords used them to show off their wealth, scare off enemies, and impress friends. Knights literally used them to promote themselves. A beautiful outfit could make a noble woman admire you, an important lord respect you, or at the very least, make it all the other knights in armor that wasn't well ventilated jealous. The danger added to the appeal. It was exciting to see a perfectly done joust, but it was also exciting to see a spectacular crash. People gasped, ladies, held onto their veils, and if there had been announcers in the Middle Ages, they would have played the moment back in slow motion. Lances that had broken off and were flying through the air looked like glitter thrown by a very angry party planner. And when the winner came out, with his plumes intact, his surcoat shining, and his shield shining, he didn't just win a tournament. He won a moment of medieval life that would last forever. People would remember, copy, and admire his clothes, armor, and colors. In medieval tournaments, glory wasn't just earned through skill. It was used. For most of the year, Rome was obsessed with order, hierarchy, discipline, and being respectable. Everyone in Rome knew what to do. Masters told slaves what to do, senators lectured, and everyone tried to look more serious than the person next to them. But every December, something amazing happened. The empire's social machinery came to a screeching halt, took a deep breath, and threw itself into happy chaos. This was Saturnalia, the one time of year when Rome officially stopped acting like it was civilized. The festival started on December 17th, but the Romans had been getting ready for it for a long time before that. People knew the rules were about to melt like butter in the Mediterranean sun shops as soon as the first decorations went up. These included green wreaths, pine boughs, and small Saturn figurines. Work went away. Duties went away. People said that even the gods let their belts out to enjoy the chaos. And it was a mess. Saturnalia was more than just a vacation. It was a short-lived revolution. The strict rules that usually held Roman society together suddenly became less clear. Masters and slaves ate at the same tables. Kids made fun of their dads. Masters fed the slaves. And for once, the slaves could talk freely, and sometimes very freely, which scared and entertained the people in the house. People walked around the streets in bright caps called palui, which were symbols of freedom that were usually only worn by free men. That was crazy enough on its own. But with the drinking, singing, public jokes, and lack of inhibitions, it was like an old-fashioned block party that went on for days. Rome turned into a loud city. Dice hitting stone tables, flutes being played loudly by musicians in alleyways, people on their balconies yelling hello to each other while holding amphorae of wine. People who didn't know each other gave each other gifts. Figurines made of wax, candles, and pastries shaped in ways that were not meant for kids. Even though gambling was usually against the law, everyone did it. There were no rules during Saturnalia, or, to put it another way, everything that was embarrassing was encouraged, but the mood was the most interesting thing about it all. The constant stress of Roman life, whether it was political, social, or economic, went away like smoke. Something unusual took its place. Laughing, real, free laughter that flows through the streets like a warm breeze. Rome let go for one wonderful week. It forgot about order, forgot about being serious, and forgot about itself. And at the center of it all, Saturn ruled over happy chaos, not with power, but with joy. The role reversal was the one tradition that defined Saturnalia and made conservative Romans clutch their togas in moral panic. For this short time, the whole structure of Rome turned upside down like a badly run chariot. Servants became masters, servants turned into masters, and everyone acted like this was completely normal and not a little scary for the rich. As soon as Saturnalia started, families all over Rome did an act that means something. They took off the collars of the slaves. Men and women who were slaves traded in their usual work clothes for brighter ones, and sometimes even borrowed their master's old clothes. Tunics in bright colors, cloaks with expensive edges, or sandals so nice that they wouldn't be allowed to wear them the rest of the year. And of course, everyone, slaves and free people alike, wore the puss, the soft cone-shaped hat of freedom. For a week, everyone in the empire wore hats that were basically said, "No one is the boss today." The change didn't stop with clothes. The master didn't only sit at the table in private homes, he gave it to them. That meant pouring wine with the care of someone who was afraid of spilling it. It meant giving out food. It meant watching as the slaves, who were usually quiet, obedient, and invisible, now lay on couches like emperors, making fun of the cooking and telling jokes that no one dared to tell during the rest of the year. Saturnalia was the only time slaves could insult their masters without getting in trouble. Some people kept it light-hearted, while others got creative. Romans wrote about slaves who would recite long, funny monologues about their owners' bad habits, stinginess, cheating, or famously bad singing voices. They had to laugh, or at least act like they did. The streets sounded the same way. Satinius Princeps, the king of Saturnalia, could be elected by a poor man to boss everyone around for the day with silly orders and dumb orders. Sing, bring me more food, dance, and drink. The real king of Saturnalia didn't have a lot of power. He was a mess. His rule was more about being bad than being in charge. To people who weren't there, it must have looked like a holiday that was really anarchy. But Romans thought that this chaotic ritual brought order back to society. Saturnalia let the lower ranks make fun of the higher ones, which let pressure out of the system. Rome acted like everyone was equal for a week. It was loud, messy, and undignified, but it also strangely healed, if a Roman person. Saturnalia meals were the complete opposite of this. They were chaotic, overflowing, and very indulgent. The festival wasn't just about eating, it was the heart that kept it going. For 7 days in a row, Rome basically declared war on moderation. The mood started in the kitchens, where cooks, who were usually overworked and enslaved, suddenly became the stars. It looked like the city was getting ready for a siege. Cauldrons steamed, ovens roared, and every pantry was ransacked, except for thee. The goal was to eat too much, not to live. Even the simplest families could find enough food for at least one big meal. But when it came to rich families, they went all out with the imperial drama. The tables were full of food that looked like buildings you could eat. Honey-glazed piglets that have been roasted, sausages that look like garlands, stews made with chickpeas that were so full of herbs that they almost glowed green, pastries that have been fried and then sprinkled with powdered sugar, dates filled with almonds, and huge plates full of figs, pears, and pomegranates. And this was before the wine started to flow. They didn't serve wine nicely. Saturnalia was about letting go of self-control. Pictures were passed around endlessly. Cups were too big, and mixing your wine with too much water, which is usually a sign of good manners, was a sign of weakness. People raised their glasses to Saturn, to each other, to the city, to the gods, and to nothing in particular. Someone sneezed, someone dropped their cup, and then someone else toasted. But the seating arrangement was the real surprise. In wealthy homes, slaves who were usually not allowed to sit at the table were invited to the feast as equals. They relaxed on the soft couches and tried the best food. Their masters, on the other hand, brought them trays, poured wine, and got them more bread. It wasn't just a symbol, it was meant to be humbling, and it made the feasts hard to predict. Masters fumbled with plates, trying not to spill sauces or drop amory on anyone's lap. The slaves, who were encouraged by tradition and wine, and gave the food a serious review like it was a play. You could say, a little too salty, not enough pepper, another person would say, and the master would nod like a scolded apprentice chef. The feast spilled into the streets. Pop-up vendors fried honey cakes. Musicians played flutes and drums. Crowds danced with greasy fingers, and the whole city smelled like roasted meat and warm bread. Rome turned into one big dining hall where no one counted calories, coins, or consequences. For 1 week, gluttony wasn't a vice. It was a civic duty, and Rome performed it with gusto. If Saturnalia had a softer, sweeter side, something that balanced the chaos, drinking, and roasted animals, it was the tradition of gift-giving. And Rome took this tradition just as seriously as it took its feasting, meaning with enthusiasm, creativity, and absolutely zero sense of moderation. If you think modern holiday shopping gets chaotic, imagine it without malls, credit cards, or price tags. But with. After too much wine, thousands of Romans yelled in marketplaces. The most common Saturnalia gifts were simple things like candles that stood for light in the darkest time of year. They ranged from tiny wax tapers to huge torches that looked like someone accidentally wrapped a small tree in beeswax. People also gave each other sigillaria, small clay or wax figures shaped like gods, animals, children, or sometimes things that made Roman parents cough awkwardly and pretend not to notice friends, neighbors, lovers, clients, and even they. Some of the gifts were funny, while others were very meaningful. A wax lion meant strength, a clay dove meant peace, and a tiny figurine shaped like your friend's pet was thoughtful. A figurine shaped like your friend's bald spot was the spirit of Saturnalia. It was okay to tease without getting in trouble. But not all gifts were small. Wealthy Romans used Saturnalia as an excuse to show off. They gave out silver cups, embroidered clothes, exotic fruits, perfume bottles, writing tablets, and more. Chests of rare spices. Some even gave their slaves temporary bonuses so they could spend them on gambling or drinks, which was a short time when kindness and recklessness went hand in hand. Still, the real fun came from getting something new. Romans loved getting strange gifts. One writer complains about getting a set of miniature bronze cows for no reason. Another talks about a friend who gave him a single shoe, saying the other would arrive next Saturday, Saturnalia. Prank gifts were encouraged. The more confusing the gift, the better the reaction. The markets were full of shoppers who were grabbing last-minute trinkets. Stalls sold little sculptures, carved dice, jewelry, perfumes, pastries, and anything small enough to carry, but interesting enough to avoid the dreaded reaction. "Oh, thank you. What is it?" sellers shouted over each other. Children tugged at their parents' tunics, begging for toys, and pickpockets enjoyed their own version of gift collection. But the true magic wasn't the objects themselves, it was the mood. Saturnalia gifts weren't about duty or show, they were about shared joy. For 1 week, Romans remembered each other. They laughed, exchanged tokens of affection or mischief, and strengthened bonds across classes and households. In a culture famous for its rigid seriousness, Saturnalia gave Rome permission to be warm, generous, and delightfully silly. If you wanted to witness Rome at its most uninhibited, chaotic, and gleefully irresponsible, you didn't go to the feasts, you went to the gaming table. Saturnalia unleashed something deep in the Roman soul, a primal urge to gamble. The same senators who passed solemn laws banning gambling the rest of the year suddenly found themselves hunched over dice boards, shouting like drunken gladiators. During Saturnalia, all gambling bans vanished, and Rome collectively declared, "Fortune favors the foolish." The streets turned into casinos with no roofs. Dice clattered on marble floors, wooden stalls, dusty doorsteps, tavern counters, and even temple steps, which made people angry. Priests pretended not to see. People crowded around makeshift gaming mats, cheering and jeering as fortunes changed in minutes. Children played with nuts, adults with coins, and a few overconfident people with things they would regret losing the next morning. The most popular game was a layer, a simple but addictive dice game. Romans threw knucklebones, or six-sided dice with all the dramatic energy of modern poker champions. A perfect throw brought instant bragging rights. A bad throw brought groans, laughter, and theatrical despair. Some players developed rituals for luck, kissing the dice, whispering to them, tapping them on statues of Saturn, or even blowing on them while praying for divine assistance. Saturn, god of liberation, must have been exhausted, but gambling wasn't limited to dice. Romans played tabula, an ancestor of bagamon. Ludus duodecim scriptorum, card like games with painted tiles, and competitive drinking games that definitely counted as gambling when throwing the dice made people groan, laugh, and act like they were going to die. Some players had lucky rituals, like kissing the dice, whispering to them, tapping them on statues of Saturn, or even blowing on them while praying for help from above. Saturn, the god of freedom, must have been tired. But Romans didn't just play with dice. They also played tabula, which is an ancestor of bigamon, and ludus duodecim scriptorum, card games with painted tiles, and competitive drinking games that definitely counted as gambling. Wages were tied to personal honor. During Saturnalia, even respectable women, who were usually models of restraint, would join games with mischievous glee, smirking as they beat their husbands at dice in front of the household slaves. The enslaved were also allowed to gamble openly for once. Their masters even gave them coins to lose, which they tried to do, and when enslaved gamblers won against their own masters, the cheers could shake the walls. It was a rare, precious moment when luck didn't care about status. Of course, with all the chaos, someone always tried to cheat. Loaded dice showed up. People switched pieces when no one was looking. Arguments broke out. But Satinia had its own rules. Cheating was wrong, unless you were smart enough not to get caught. That Roman said that was part of the fun. Gambling during Saturnalia wasn't just for fun. It was a way to let off steam, a brief, exciting rebellion against Rome's normally stuffy seriousness. For one glorious week, everyone from senators and slaves rolled the same dice, and for once, luck was on everyone's side. If the feasts and gambling made Roman homes exciting, the streets of Rome during Saturnalia were a whole different story. The city turned into a living carnival, loud, unpredictable, full of energy, and impossible to escape. You couldn't celebrate Saturnalia quietly. It happened to you whether you liked it or not. From dawn until late at night, every alley, forum, bathhouse, and the courtyard was full of people. Musicians walked around the city playing flutes, drums, lyres, and anything else that made noise. Groups of people would form parades, and children would run around with clay figurines. Revelers waved evergreen branches and shouted, Eo Saturnalia, at strangers, just like people do when they want to say Happy New Year after too much champagne. And then there were the costumes. Romans didn't dress up as animals or mythical creatures. This wasn't a masquerade, but they did. People dressed in strange ways. They wore bright colors, mismatched patterns, and sometimes over the top wigs or funny imitations of stereotypes. Others wrapped themselves in garlands or painted their faces. Saturnalia was not the time for dignity. Even the normally strict Roman manners went out the window. Strangers talked freely, neighbors laughed together, and people greeted each other as equals, even if one lived in a mansion and the other lived in a tenement. Saturnalia flattened the social pyramid into a crowded, noisy, joyful citywide.